Welcome, Leah Ypi, philosopher and author.
Thank you for having me.
Your new book is called Indignity, A Life Reimagined. Could you talk a little bit about what it's about?
Yeah, it's in part family history, in part a book about political history of Europe, mainly focused in the interwar period, but really until the World War II and then the end of World War II. It's in part a philosophical investigation on the concept of dignity, centered around the life of a woman, Leman Ypi, my grandmother, who was born in Salonika, contemporary Greece, just before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and who died in Albania in 2006, a few years after the end of communism, and whose life travels across political systems, countries, and raises the question of what it means to live with dignity in a time of extremes.
And it starts out with a rather fascinating episode from your own life, right? Quite recently. There's a photograph that you discover online. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it started with me receiving a text message from a friend who said, "Have you noticed that your grandmother has become viral on Facebook?" And went on Facebook and discovered this photo of her that I had never seen before, posted by someone I had never met before, followed by several derogatory comments that were making allegations about her life. The photograph was taken in the winter of 1941. It was in a ski resort, and judging by the winter outfit and the place where it was taken, it must have been taken during her honeymoon in the Italian Dolomites in that year. I knew about this period of her life from her stories, and she had often spoken of it as the happiest time of her life. And I've often wondered about what it meant to live the happiest time of your life in the winter of 1941, when World War II has entered its most destructive phase. But there was nothing left to search, because I was also told that all the records around my grandmother's youth disappeared when the communists confiscated all her belongings, at the point in which my grandfather, who was also in the photo with her, was arrested by the Albanian communist government when it came to power in 1946 in Albania. So there was this image of a time of which I had no images, and where I thought everything was lost, and also the allegations that she might have been a communist spy or a fascist spy, or some people said she'd been both, which made me want to, in part, respond to these allegations and in part find the truth of this life by going to the source of this photo, which turned out to be the Albanian archive, where all the documents of the former Secret Service surveillance are kept. And so I filed requests and went into the archive, and the book begins with this journey of trying to piece together my grandmother's life, in part based on these reports filed on her by the people who spied on her, but in part also it's a life reimagined, because it's taking off from a series of mysteries and gaps in the archive that are then filled with critical imagination.
Mm. And it's about your grandmother and her relation to the events that occurred in the Balkans and in this part of the history, and also her relation to the communist regime in Albania, right? So could you tell us a bit about your family history and their class position and their relation to the communist regime?
Yeah, so my grandmother was born in Salonika to an elite family that whose ancestors had been Ottoman administrators, so had been posted in various provinces of the Ottoman Empire, whose family identity was very much connected to the Ottoman Empire, and whose family fortunes also changed with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. She lived in then Greece for the first part of her life, then moved to Albania as an 18-year-old, in part as a result of the pressure on minorities that followed the rise of the new nation states in the Balkans and the end of World War I. In Albania, she met my grandfather, who was himself also the son of an elite family as well, whose father was eventually a fascist collaborator. He was the prime minister of Albania at the point in which the country was taken over by the Italian fascists when they invaded in 1939, but he himself was a social democrat who had met the communist leader Enver Hoxha at the time in which both were studying in Paris as 18, 20-year-old students. and had been involved with him in the Popular Front, was very much part of the socialist and communist movement that was fighting the fascists in France in the 1930s. Then went to Albania, came into contact with British intelligence officers who were posted in Albania during the war, and for that reason was eventually arrested and trialed for agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British intelligence services by the communist government that came to power, and from then on became a political prisoner for 15 years. And my grandmother was the wife of someone who was in prison, and single mother, was deported in the countryside, completely separated from her family, who was left in Greece. And so she herself had this radical change of fortune from being from this wealthy elite aristocratic family to being the wife of a political prisoner with all of society against her. And the book really sort of documents and reconstructs all these trials of her life.
And looking back on the 20th century, and what this book describes is sort of the destructive power of nationalism and the rise of nationalism really breaking up people's lives and sort of breaking up communities, and this idea that you need an ethnically homogeneous state. It's very easy now to look back and think of, it's tempting to have sort of a nostalgia for these multi-ethnic empires that existed before the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. It seems that was there another route that could have been taken? Could they have survived? Could we have had a less destructive 20th century history, do you think? Could they have been reconstructed? Could we have something else besides the nation state that sort of organized history, do you think?
Well, I mean, there were very few projects that were thinking about alternatives to the empire that were not themselves nation-state alternatives. And in my other academic work, I've studied a little bit this school of Austro-Marxist philosophers who are interested in what they called non-territorial political autonomy, who were thinking very much about democratizing the empire, but also about the limits of the nation-states, while in some ways applauding the nationality as a principle of organizing cultural life. But we're really thinking about this intersection of nations on the one hand and the nation-state principle on the other hand. I think this world that my grandmother lived in was indeed a world in which nationalism was combined with the state, and so this combination of the power of the state with the nationality principle that forced these multicultural cosmopolitan units to divide and to fragment and to brought up what was then called the unmixing of people. So this idea that people had been mixed for centuries, living in different provinces of these empires, the Habsburg, the Ottoman, the Russian, at some point had to live by a very different principle that forced cultural and linguistic homogeneity onto collectives. And a lot of the book, I think, is about not just the toxic power of nationalism and the nation state, but about the combination of when nationalism and the nationality principle gets instrumentalized on the face of a global financial crisis like the Wall Street crash of 1929, with all its repercussions on the life of these new fragile states that were emerging in Europe at that time. So it was, on the one hand, about this power of globalization and global capitalism and the oppressive nature of global capitalism, but on the other hand, also about the limits of the nation state as a way of countering those pressures and the kinds of exclusions that it itself generates when it tries to do so.
Mm. Do you think that perhaps the European Union could be sort of a successor to these multi-ethnic states, that they could sort of transcend nationalism?
Well, I mean, at some level, there is something very promising about this idea of transcending the nation state and transcending this principle that is a homogenizing and in many ways exclusionary principle. But I think it really depends on what we mean by the European Union, because I think the European Union is very much an open project that could be taken in one direction or another. What I see right now is an effort by the right to take over and to exercise both cultural hegemony, but also a sense of directing the political vision of the EU in a dimension that's very different from how the EU was initially conceived, and to create a kind of fortress Europe that polices its outer boundary with the same violence and the same strength that the nation state polices its boundary. So if the idea is to replace the nation state exclusion with an exclusion that's just a little bit larger, on a larger scale, but also very forceful and also generates all this oppression on its borders. I don't think that's necessarily a very attractive ideal. I think European Union is at its most attractive when it's thought of as an example of a cosmopolitan institution that is has this perpetual opening and perpetual inclusive drive as parts of its raison d'etre. And whether it's one or the other depends on the kind of politics that underpins it and the kind of political projects and narratives that drive it forward. So I don't think the answer is in the EU by itself. It's in the projects about the EU that are developed by various political actors.
Mm. We'll get back to this issue. I want to mention also your previous book, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, which is it's a biography of your coming of age in Albania. So it's closely tied to this new book. Could you say something about the subtitle of that book, Coming of Age at the End of History?
Well, it's a kind of ironic nod to Fukuyama and to this idea that with the end of Cold War, we reached the end of history understood as a clash between different ideologies. And in many ways, there's this footnote in Fukuyama where he talks about what history is and how it affects smaller people. And he says at some point, well, if we ask ourselves what makes history, how we think about the pressures of history, we don't really need to think about what the Albanians think of it. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote that book, which is very much a coming of age story, and it's a story of someone who grows up in Albania from the last years of communism to the arrival of capitalism. When I wrote the book, I thought, well, maybe you should ask someone like Albania, and it's very much a first-hand account of what this transition looked like and what it meant for someone to fully replace the categories of thinking that had been accompanied upbringing in communism to capitalism and these changes in ideologies, in particular concerning the concept of freedom. So the book really is an effort to think about this dilemma and these tensions and these contradictions between freedom as an ideology, both in communism and in later capitalist Albania, and freedom as an ideal, which is what was following this effort to change society throughout the 1980s and 90s, and in many ways also the illusions and the betrayals of freedom in both political systems for different reasons.
Mm. Yeah, Francis Fukuyama's thesis in his essay and his book called The End of History was that liberal democracy was sort of the ideological endpoint of humanity. There was no way to sort of improve upon that mode of governance. And did it feel that way to you when you were growing up and communism collapsed and sort of the world was changing? Did it feel like this is indeed the end of history? This is the end point now, and we're not going anywhere. History has sort of reached its end point.
Well, I mean, that was part of the discourse of transition, this idea that you were going to realize this society of freedom that had been promised and that people had been dreaming of throughout communism, and that would finally be delivered via this combination of free markets on the one hand and opening up of political systems to political pluralism on the other. On the other hand, the 90s were really difficult periods, and actually also the years that followed were a very difficult period because the country experienced the so-called shock therapy that came with enforced waves of privatization and liberalization of state sectors and with huge waves of emigration. So these were the years in which Albanians started leaving the country in mass, and that exodus in many ways still continues. They were very dark years because people lost their jobs, and it was a breakup of family structures of solidarity. This was the impact both of emigration, but also of just alienation and a lack of solidarity, because a new rhetoric of neoliberalism was that everyone was responsible for themselves and the individual was the final goal of developing. The individual was the final goal of society, and so taking responsibility for other people and for the failures of other people was seen also as a failure. So I think in terms of the discourse, it was very much a rhetoric of perhaps not the end of history, but a rhetoric of freedom and of finally having realized freedom, where even the gaps were often internalized. And so people would say, well, it's corruption that stands in the way, or it's this backward nature, or it's the legacy of the communist past that is preventing this full realization. Because on the one hand, you had this discourse that this is finally a free society, but on the other hand, you had this very obvious empirical experience of not being in a society where freedom was there for everyone, where there was a lot of hardship and the need to leave the country, or there was this kind of coercive nature of social relations, whether economic or social, cultural. So I think it was this, perhaps, as I say, I wouldn't put it as end of history, but there was definitely this tension between the ideal of freedom and the real life experience of people under this new system.
Yeah. The idea of the end of history, I think it often gets paired with this sort of Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase that there is no alternative, which is more of an economic argument, that there's no alternative to sort of privatization and free markets. But I think Francis Fukuyama's thesis was more in the political arena, that there is no real ideological competitor to liberal capitalism, or to liberal democracy rather, which includes private property as one element. And there hadn't really been since the French Revolution that sort of history. It almost ended in the French Revolution when the ideal of equality for all and freedom for all, those ideals can't be improved upon. You can only try to work to fulfill them, but there's no need to sort of have a different conception of a civilized society than those ideals. And he says that there are no contradictions within liberal democracy. Would you agree with him that liberal democracy is indeed sort of the best mode of governance that we can think that we can come up with, and we only need to sort of strive to actually implement all those beautiful ideals in practice? Or do you think that there is an alternative system that we could move to that indeed would be better?
I mean, it depends on what we mean by liberal democracy. So I think under capitalism, it's very hard to have both freedom and democracy. I think there's a constant tension between the two. And the moments where capitalism seems to be contained and seems to deliver freedom for everyone or democracy everyone, which are very few and isolated historical episodes, often concentrated in certain parts of the world just for a time, are because of fights to change the system. So I don't think that there's an inherent teleology of capitalism that delivers freedom and democracy. I do think that freedom is a worthwhile ideal. External freedom is something to aspire to. I personally think, and this is something that runs through both of my books, that freedom is about something that we experience in the moment of moral responsibility. And so in a way, it's not completely dependent on external institutional realization. It's, in fact, the moral drive that pushes us to change those institutions in a certain direction. Democracy is a way of thinking about freedom in a social and political relation. So it has this connection to freedom in that it's about how you justify power in a way that is most freedom preserving. And that's what democracy is, the rule of the many. And the idea that you think about political power, not as the power of the few, of the oligarchs, or of the better, the aristocracy, but as the power of the people. I do think, though, that, as I say, because of the profit motive under capitalism, it's very hard to have freedom and democracy for everyone and to have this social relation that embodies those ideals. So it remains a sort of scattered experience that works when the political movements are fighting in the right direction. But I don't think that there is anything automatic about it. And I think that both freedom and democracy require in many ways overcoming capitalism. And to the extent that those arguments about the end of history didn't really engage with the question of the material structure, or didn't really engage with the question of what is the relationship between the market and the state and the international institutions. The drive of international institutions was very much one of opening to the market and globalizing and thinking about the benefits of globalization as something that automatically follows from opening markets and privatizing and following the lead of this homo economicus. I think all of those have now been shown to be mistaken and call for a different way of thinking about this relationship between international institutions on the one hand, states on the other, and markets on the other.
Mm-hmm. So, in your view, as long as we have capitalism, we'll have concentrations of wealth that are inimical to democracy. You can't have one person, one vote, and then have people with huge wealth that can sort of influence the political system. Is that your view?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can have the one person, one vote recognized in principle as it is, and you can have that the motive that drives reform in countries where that isn't the case, because there are violations from authoritarian systems or abuses by states of the power of individuals. But I also think that under a capitalist system, the pressure and the power of someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, who controls information, who controls the means of production, who controls the epistemic power in society depends on technology and on information and on education being in a certain way, the power of an individual like that is much higher than the power of someone who has no means and just lives off their salary and often has to struggle to get to the end of the month, or is on a precarious job, or drives an Uber or whatever. So I think these imbalances of wealth and power bring with them political imbalances in the voice that citizens have in the public sphere, and that undermine this very simple idea that democracy is about actually equal power and justification of coercion that takes the same form to everyone.
And so how should we try to overcome this system? How should we sort of rein in the power of these oligarchs? Should we raise taxes? Should we regulate them? Should we build out the public sector? Should we organize workplaces in a different way? Or what's the sort of, what kind of measures would you propose, and how would we enact them?
So I think, the question of the measures is contingent. Different people in different social positions will have aspects of their lives where they can ask this question. So if you're a journalist, this question looks very different for if someone who is a banker or a lawyer, if you're an academic. So I think each of us first has to see in what aspect of their life does this question come up. In my case, it comes up with education, and so with what ideas you suggest working on, and with what critical analysis of society, how you read history, how you think about the connection between the present and the past. For someone who is in a different position, it will be different. I think there are a number of proposals out there already in terms of how you can control capitalism, or how you can even overcome capitalism, and what it takes to, for example, have public ownership of certain critical infrastructure, or how to think about digital media and control of that, to make sure that money and the profit motive doesn't determine the goals of this way in which information flows, or surveillance through digital media operates in society. You can think about management of companies, and so the imbalances between employees and employers, and you can think about the power of workers in changing that. I think a very important element of the discussion is what political parties' narratives there are that drives debate in the public sphere. And I think that parties have a huge responsibility in articulating narratives that think about the limits of the system, where what we have right now is a party as a machine that more or less just tries to win elections, but doesn't think it has a responsibility for thinking critically about society. So I don't think there is one answer to this. There are different problems, and what we think of as solutions are contextual and depend on what kind of problem we're talking about and what is at stake. But I do think that if we want to understand the crisis of the contemporary world, there's these three aspects that we need to focus on. First, the crisis of political representation. Second, the crisis of economic justice. And third, the crisis of society and of values and meaning. And in all of these, there will be lots of answers already out there, and lots of other things that we could add to make the criticism more productive.
And one theme that you've been writing about outside of your philosophizing and your writing of biographies is this problem with political parties, and how center-left parties or social democratic parties have sort of either collapsed or are in retreat across the Western world. And as you mentioned before with the EU, that far-right parties are on the rise. So how would you explain this sort of collapse of the center-left and the rise of the far-right?
I think that collapse is in many ways hostage to the end of the Cold War. And so at the end of the Cold War, on the one hand, you had the kind of failure of state socialism and of the discrediting of the very idea of socialism, which was often identified with the path of those particular states in that particular part of Europe. And on the other hand, you have the retreat and the process of transformation of the old social democratic parties into more or less liberal parties that defended the status quo, or sometimes became pioneers of neoliberalism as under the banner of the third way, this idea that there is no alternative. And so this Thatcherite program, that was very much a program of the right and indeed the conservative right, was taken up also by the left in its third way form. And the project of overcoming capitalism became the project of emancipation through the rule of law and through just regulation. And I think at this juncture, social democracy lost itself, because I think the social democracy of the origins was a project that didn't think that democracy and capitalism were compatible. It was a project that emerged very much out of a critique of capitalism that said that you can have you cannot really have democracy without overcoming capitalism. This was the beginnings. And at the point in which the social democratic parties became liberal reform parties, or became invested in the nation state, in the reform of the nation state, they lost that kind of transformative vision, and all the critiques of globalization became critiques that were based on membership. So the idea was that you can, to overcome the conflicts of globalization, you needed to think about them as conflicts to do with culture, with religion, or with integration capacity, or with historical background, historical paths. And so everything that was going wrong with globalization, and this was the narrative of the right, was a problem of membership. So if you could only figure out, if you could answer this question of who belongs where, and if you could make sure that surplus people in certain countries would return to their country of origin, if you could kind of unmix the peoples in exactly this way in which nationalism operated in the 1930s, that is the answer to the crisis of liberal democracy. That's the story of the right, of the conservative right, that uses nationality, that scapegoats minorities, that tells the story of the crisis of globalization as a story of integration, of cultural integration, or clash between civilizations and cultures. And it was a story that was also appropriated by the left, because if you look now at how, for example, social democratic parties, including in Scandinavia, go around, in Denmark or in Sweden, proposing to change things, they are often also tapping onto the same anti-migration or membership-based discourse of the right. And so there's nothing specifically social democratic about those projects, because the narrative is still given by the right, and the left just chases that narrative in hope that it will win a few votes here and there.
And why do you think the Social Democrats lost their narrative? Because they used to have this narrative that the state could intervene in the economy and could provide jobs for all, they could provide a welfare state, they could sort of control market forces. This idea that politics was more powerful than economics, that sort of the state could provide for everyone. And then in the 1990s, this idea that the state was sort of almost powerless in the face of unseen forces. Market forces were more powerful than the nation state. This idea took hold. And why do you think that is, that they sort of lost that reform idea, that politics actually could be invoked to sort of change the economy and change people's lives?
Well, I personally think because at some level that was the case. So the markets did become transnational, did become globalized, and they called for the creation of transnational institutions that did put pressure on these nation-state institutions and forced them into compromises and choices that maybe they were reluctant to make, often top-down in this very technocratic managerial. The problem was that instead of saying, okay, now let's change those institutions in a more egalitarian socialist direction, let's think about how we can contain transnational capital when it becomes transnational and it creates the institutions that adapt and somehow accommodate these pressures of transnational capital, the rhetoric was then to return to the nation state. And at that point, the nationalists, who had a more coherent story to tell about the nation state than the social democrats, whose origins had always been transnational and internationalist, lost the narrative and lost the discourse. So I think there was something in the 90s, in the zeitgeist of the 90s, where the combination of the failure of state socialism, and so at the level of ideas, the discrediting of socialism could be an alternative to capitalism seemed to become the dominant way of thinking about socialism, where even social democrats in the West, who had a lot to say for their own, successes and what they had achieved over these decades, somehow seemed to think that this was the contribution of liberalism rather than of specifically socialism, brought this conversion and this complete abandoning of the alternatives to capitalism discourse, and, as I say, a retreat and an entrenchment into liberal democracy understood in this nation-state way, and understood very much on the basis of liberal principles that didn't ask the question of how to overcome capitalism.
What's interesting to me is that it wasn't just the collapse of a communism or state socialism as a sort of alternative to capitalism. It was also in the 90s the collapse of Keynesianism and the idea that you could sort of have a regulated capitalism, which used to be the Social Democrats' view that you could, even though maybe it was just a step on the way towards socialism, that the idea that you could have it. And thinking about my own country, Sweden, in the 1990s, we used to have a fixed exchange rate, and that collapsed in the early 1990s which actually should have meant that we had a lot more power to maneuver, to control our own economic policy, because our currency wasn't fixed to anything. We didn't have to sort of keep the balance of payments in balance at all times. We could sort of choose our own fiscal policy more easily. But instead of using this newfound space to maneuver, the Social Democrats went the complete other way and sort of had this idea that the bond markets controlled how much a government could spend, and you couldn't anger the bond markets, because then the whole economy would collapse. So to what extent do you think that this was about ideas, that they adopted prevalent ideas at the time, and to what extent do you think it was more material interests or sort of structural forces in the global economy that
I think they go together. I think material interests need a narrative to be articulated in a certain way. Without a story, they don't really do anything. And that goes in all directions, both when we're talking about the interest of the public and the interest of the private. So I certainly think that there was something about the ideology of the market, and the market is a transnational force, that was driving forward very much of these fears and concerns, and this idea that if you think the future depends on thriving and flourishing markets, and the market needs to be deregulated and needs to be distinguished from the state, and the state is very much the sort of evil force in this and the market is not, then I think that ideological narrative drives forward, and of course also satisfies the interests of a certain category of people. I mean, some people did very well out of this, out of globalization, the inequalities rose, and so that means that people at the top actually had way more than they had before, so it delivered for some. It's just that if the discourse that explains everything is not an egalitarian one, and it's a discourse that says, oh, it's okay to have these inequalities because then wealth will trickle down, and so it's fine if you have people at the top who have a bit more, because that will eventually, justice will sort itself out because markets will do their magic. Then that discourse also stabilizes and brings a certain political movement into motion, and then it becomes a kind of chicken and egg question, which one, where do you start? Is it structure, is it agency? Well, it's always a bit of both, and they consolidate and reinforce each other, which is why I think it's really important to break away from that. Not just to come up with policies of how certain things need to be different, but to really recover a narrative of criticism of society that goes to the heart of the critique of capitalism, and that goes to the heart of this conundrum of democracy and capitalism can't really live together. And when they do, it's because democracy has been brought forward in the name of something that is an alternative to capitalism.
Thomas Piketty has a good quote, I think, when he says that when the idea becomes prevalent that the nation state is completely helpless in the face of global forces and economic forces, and the only thing that the state is deemed capable of regulating is its border, then that's where all the attention will be, on the border, and sort of restricting migrants and protecting the welfare state for the people that are born in the country. Do you think is what has happened in Europe and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think there's certainly that. I think I agree with that, but I also think there's another element, which is that this is the internalization of the kind of neoliberal logic that sees every responsibility attribution as a problem of individuals interacting with each other. So, migration the question of membership seems so attractive because it's a way of saying, well, there's these guys, and I can point the finger to the particular groups in society that are undermining my welfare or my justice or my equality, and it becomes a transactional question. It's not, you don't really think about the structure. You don't think about what all of us are doing to facilitate and to somehow enable the system to continue to live in the way in which it lives unperturbed, because we think, well, it's always about some bad people out there. And I think this is why, in many ways, we have overcome there's a lot of criticism of neoliberalism now. So people see what was wrong with privatization, what was wrong with certain policies, what was wrong with this emphasis on markets. But I'm not sure that we have actually really overcome the neoliberal logic that says that it's all about, again, going back to Thatcher, there is no such thing as society. There's only men and women that fight for their interest and fend off the other. And I think this is now, you can see it in the migration discourse, where it's always about the other identified as a member of another group that the culture of which serves to explain, what is it that's not going well in contemporary society. So I think it's the neoliberal logic that pervades the discourse of how you think of yourself and how you think about responsibility and identity.
the issue of migration is one that center-left parties are really struggling with now, and there have been a few different responses. Well, most of them have been to sort of move in the same direction as the far-right populists. To take the most concrete example is probably Keir Starmer in the UK, who is sort of chasing after reform voters by being tough on migrants. What do you think about that strategy?
Well, I mean, I think it's a completely wrong strategy, and I think what one needs to do on the left is to just reject the migration as a problem narrative. Because if you concede that migration is a problem, then the people who have always been saying that migration is a problem are much more credible than the ones that until yesterday or until they were out of power were saying, no, this is the right who is being scaremongering and attacking immigrants and violating rights, but the left has a different view. And then when they come to power, they do exactly the same thing. And the voting public is not stupid. People understand that if it's about exclusion, they would rather vote for the original than for the bad copy that's inconsistent and insincere and hypocritical. So I think the strategy is to just be true to one's principles and to say, well, migration really is not a problem. And actually, the right's very own approach to migration proves this, because if you think about membership as a problem and the solution, you think about how the right approaches this, and you realize that actually borders have always been open for some people and closed for other people. And the right's approach, which is, for example, to open up citizenship to the rich, to oligarchs, to enable it to be sold and bought as it was in the old days where citizenship depended on property. And the fight of the old social democrats was to say, well, actually citizenship doesn't rely on wealth and income. It's something that's universal. The right's approach now to citizenship is very much a resurrection of those ideas of citizenship based on census. And where in the same weeks in which Trump was posting these videos of people in shackles being deported on the White House flights, in those very same weeks, he was making it a lot easier for Russian oligarchs to acquire permanent leave to remain or residence by investment. And so this discourse on membership, you can see it also if you engage critically with it, that on the right, it's completely two-sided, because on the one hand, it makes it a lot easier for, Arab oligarchs to acquire property in London and to buy accelerated residence. And on the other hand, it makes it really hard for people who want to come and join their working families from somewhere else when they don't have the means or when they can't pay for a citizenship test, or these days they don't even get, they don't get given a visa if they don't show that they have enough income. So it's really a way of punishing the poor and enabling the rich to take even more advantage of the poor, both domestic and outside. So I think the left really needs to return to this question of class when it comes to membership, and to return to this idea that actually migration really is not about borders, but it's about class. And so it's punishing people from a certain social class and rewarding people from the rich class. And it's there that the struggles of membership and the struggles of social justice combine to explain that there's a very different way of thinking about this question that's not at all to do with culture and religion. Because if you care about religion, it's not clear, or culture, it's not clear why, someone who has a lot more money should have it a lot easier. So.
But to push back a little bit on that, there are people on the left who say that the working class are those who are most affected by the problem of migration, that migrants come and they can work for lower wages, employers use migrants to dump wages, they also say that they use the welfare state, they live off the sort of hardworking natives, or they take their jobs. How would you respond to those people?
So first of all, just to start with the last one, that is factually not true, so that migrants are not a net burden on welfare state. They often contribute because they feel labor shortages and they bring skills that are missing, and if they find a job, it's because there are possibilities. And there's a demographic crisis in many of these countries that receive migrants, which are also filled by so I don't think factually, empirically, that is the case. But even that, and I'm not that fond of those arguments, because I don't like arguments that instrumentalize people, that say it looks as though it's kind of there's something dehumanizing about thinking about the migrant as just a resource or as someone who feels a labor shortage or who does certain things. And I think the discussions that start by saying actually migration is not a net burden are problematic, because they then already put you in a certain way of thinking about migration. So I'd rather go on the other beginning of your question, which is, is it true that employers prefer migrants? And I think that's not the case. They prefer migrants without rights. So the question is not the migrant as such. The question is the rights that migrants have to support themselves or to be in a labor market, and what kind of union participation possibilities they have, how the structures of solidarity between domestic working class and migrant working class, and where there are those gaps, because unions are often conservative and are not as open to migrant labor, or the structures of union representation are often restricted by citizenship. That is the case. Then employers can take advantage of that. And so one way of fighting the power of the unions is indeed to have migrants without right. And so you have this tension. But then you have to ask yourself the question, okay, but what do you do? Is the migrant there the problem, or is it capital? And again, to take the fight from the workers fighting each other to workers, actually both of them, domestic and foreign, holding capital to account and fighting for rights for both.
I think that's a very important issue, a very important thing to say, that it's actually migrants without rights that are lower wages because they are exploitable. It's the fact that they can be deported, that they are there illegally. That's what makes them so vulnerable. That's what makes them work for crumbs. Milton Friedman had a quote that he said that migration has problems, but illegal immigration is sort of that's the kind of migration that we want, because then they won't have access to the welfare state, they won't be able to exercise their rights, but they'll come and work for us. So and that's sort of where the United States has been, sort of in this gray zone with a lot of people that are there illegally, but they are sort of tolerated because they work these really tough jobs that other people don't want to do. So I think it's possible to make an argument that immigration is, from an economic perspective, immigration is almost always good, and it because immigrants, they don't just supply labor, they also add to demand, and they work tough jobs and that enable natives to move up to better jobs, and they sort of expand the economic pie. And if they're unemployed, that's more an issue of bad economic policy that doesn't employ the resources that are there in the country. So I think it's quite easy to make this economic argument that immigration is good, but there's also this argument that immigration, whether it's good or bad on net, is one thing, but immigration also brings challenges. You need to make sure that people learn the language. You need to make sure that they find somewhere to live. You need to make sure that they are included in the formal labor market and don't work in a sort of gray area where they can undermine work conditions, where they commit crime and things like that. So how do you sort of provide a message that says, yes, immigration is good, but it can also bring problems? Isn't it difficult for the left to sort of have a truthful and nuanced message to compete with the sort of far-right populists that just say, just don't let them in at all?
Well, I mean, so all of these questions that you mentioned around integration, having adequate housing and so on, that could also be problems of the domestic working class under conditions of oppression, right? When you don't have the right distribution in societies, when you don't have social justice, then the poor could have equal problems of integration, of crime. And so there's nothing essential about, being an immigrant that makes you more prone to commit crime or to break the law or to not do well in school, to take drugs or whatever. I think that's just a condition of alienation, of disenfranchisement. And so if we're not convinced that it's something cultural, something special about being born in Sweden as opposed to Albania that makes you somehow think that you're a nicer person than someone who is born in Albania, if you don't essentialize culture in those ways, and if you think that actually it's economic exclusion and injustice that accounts for this alienation and anomie, I don't really see that the migration and dividing between migrants and domestic workers in this way is productive. This discussion actually around the language reminds me very much of the old liberal aristocratic critiques against opening the voting to everyone. So there's these discussions around the franchise in the 19th century where only the rich had access to votes and only the rich had access to political power, and you had these property qualifications. And one of the arguments from the old liberal elites for why you shouldn't let poor people vote wasn't just about they don't have money. It was, well, if you don't have money, you don't have education. If you don't have education, you don't speak the national language. You just speak some regional dialect. If you can't read and write, then what competencies can you have? And yet the working class movement was really fighting against this because it saw the project of political emancipation as a project that would go hand in hand with inclusion, education, opening up, making sure that people would learn to read and write and engage in public. And they didn't think, oh, well, then now let's just leave them without a vote because they can't speak the national language, they can only speak some regional dialect, or they can't read and write, they can't read the papers, they don't really know how to be a member of the public sphere. So it's sort of, to me, it's absurd that this is now an argument from the left when it talks about, exclusion of migrants, to say, well, migrants don't speak the national language, or migrants are not really integrating, because sure, that's a challenge and that's what you do, and this is how you open up the public sphere and you fight for exactly those kinds of, these are the dimensions of inclusion that we should be fighting, as opposed to taking up this argument of the right and saying, yeah, they're right, and now we need to really think about this is really the challenge, because I think that's just not where the challenge is. And it's a sign of having abandoned the discourse around the meaning of democracy and the relationship between democracy and citizenship, which, as I said, was the core of social democracy, and it had nothing to do with national culture or national language or these sort of essentializing elements. It really was about political emancipation, and it's very sad that we're actually having these discussions now from social democratic parties.
Yeah, and dividing and conquering along ethnic lines is sort of the oldest trick in the book for the employer class. So it's kind of funny to hear it from the so-called left sometimes, I think. But how would you say that there are any concrete positive examples now of anyone pushing back against this development, this slide toward the far right and even toward fascism in some places? Do you see any good antidotes out there?
I think there are a lot of cases of civic resistance in defense, for example, of irregular migrants. You can see, civil society organizations that put a lot of pressure trying to stop deportation flights. And there's a lot of kind of models of civic virtue in resisting this discourse and in taking up the cause of irregular migrants, or in, for example, rejecting this logic of now creating extraterritorial detention centers, which sees where this is going and how it's a slippery slope, this creation of deportation centers outside the borders of, for example, core of EU countries. So I think there are a lot of examples of civic activism that pick that up, but unfortunately, unless there is a coordinated, large-scale discourse that really counters this narrative, these will always be limited to models of individual virtue, and I think it's really a responsibility of political parties on the left to pick a level of analysis that is adequate and then to create the discourse and alternatives that counter the dominant logic, and this I'm not really seeing.
Yeah, there's a problem of changing discourse because it takes a long time, and if people are stuck inside one paradigm, it's really hard to make them come around and change their paradigm completely. So there are some people on the left that say we can't really compete in this arena. We can't go out and say let's have more immigration when the whole discourse is slanted towards anti-immigration so far to the right. So there are those that say let's just focus on the economy. Let's just focus on jobs and growth and the welfare state and economic rights. You have Zoran Mandani in New York, who's just been completely focused on affordability, which is sort of a message that can unite people that otherwise wouldn't agree with each other, but they can all agree that the rent is too high. So what do you think about that sort of tactical approach in the moment that we are in right now?
Well, I think it's limited. I'm not against it. So obviously it's important to speak of those issues as well. And in many ways, it's good to replace one enemy with another enemy. So to say this enemy is not the migrant, but it's capital. And then to say, well, it's affordability is about distribution of power and wealth and means of life. So I don't have a problem with that narrative. But insofar as we're talking about a kind of hegemony of discourse of the right, which really drags on and on with this anti-migration, which makes culture the culprit and the trenches along which the war is fought. I think that, you know, you still need to work at the level of discourse. So I don't think you can completely abandon trying to challenge the categories through which people think, because this is ultimately how they make sense of the political world. And so, of course, different people have different responsibilities. If you're an elected official, then your job is to kind of get elected. And if you're Mamdani, then if there is a strategy that is more pragmatic and delivers, and you have evidence that it delivers, then I wouldn't say no, now change tack and just talk about, you know, how to create a better world for everyone, including people who are not in New York, including people who are not in the United States, including, you know, everyone, and have this more cosmopolitan approach. I think different people have, in their different social positions, have different responsibilities, and I'm very open to being pragmatic and to thinking about compromise. For me, the core question is, when you compromise, what do you compromise? And the question and the worry is that a lot of the contemporary social democratic parties have compromised on their core, on their identity as social democratic parties. And at that point, I'm not really sure that you can come back from that. And it seems like a slippery slope that condemns you eventually to disappear because you just don't know who you are anymore.
And that's something that comes up time and time again when you look at interviews with voters who have switched parties from social democrats to far-right parties or to populist parties. Is this idea that the social democrats have lost their identity. They have lost the will to sort of reform society, have lost the will to provide pensions and to provide jobs and to provide income and also to provide community among the working class. So it really is this idea that they have lost this idea that politics can sort of triumph over economics, so to speak. To go back to something we said before, let's see, where was I? We'll probably have to cut this part because I lost my train of thought. We were talking about economic rights and Mamdani. And one area where the far right has had an advantage, I think, is that they tie their discourse to really strong emotions and to sort of visceral feelings. They tie this issue of crime and they bring up the most heinous crimes, and then they tie that to migration, and you can get a really strong and visceral reaction from people that way. And for the left to counter this, do you think that they need to work on this more emotional level? They can't just sort of try to convince people intellectually. They also need to have these strong emotions involved in some way. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think people respond to double standards. And so I agree that, you can't just, the reason alone and arguments alone are probably insufficient, and that there is something to work with, which is along the lines of emotions or things that you take for granted, sort of shared culture, ways of being, and so on. But I think people, what they respond, and often what they respond with kind of crime and all of these scenes, it's nothing about the other specifically or about the other culture. It's just this hypocrisy and double standards. And actually, there's nothing easier to expose than the double standards of capitalism and these lives that control us, these people that control us, whose lives are made of luxury and saying that they care for the environment while they go on private planes and private jets. And so there is so much to be done with exposing hypocrisy and moral failures in a number of other subjects. And I'm always very mindful. I don't like the idea that you single out individuals or you single out groups to say that, this is a case of corruption or a failure. And I think that discourse, although it's important, it needs to be brought alongside a larger narrative, which is really about patterns in society. Because it's very easy to say, well, the problem is Elon Musk or it's Jeff Bezos or it's Peter Thiel. But ultimately, these characters are fungible. If it wasn't them, it would be someone else who would be pursuing the same logic of capitalist accumulation and profit. And that would not be very helpful if you just single out the individual. So I think it's important to have stories and to be able to share the stories in a way that also drives on these emotions and brings these examples of double standards and moral failures. But I think it's important that the stories also go with a broader and a larger reaching narrative of what goes on, and with an analysis that isn't limited to just the personal story and just the emotions and just the individual cases.
And to bring it back to your books, are the narratives that you have crafted in these two books, are they connected to your political convictions in some way, or is this a separate project?
No, they're very much part of the same project. So I think for me, in a way, there's a difference between when I write more philosophical, more political texts and when I write literature, because when I write about philosophical ideas, I'm interested in, exploring the idea, but also checking, what are the criticisms, responding to the criticism, and it's a much more, in many ways, a more top-down approach, different way of doing it. With literature, I think there is always ambiguity in moving back and forth between ideas and lives, because ideas never reveal themselves in lives in the kind of clear way in which they reveal themselves in theory. And it's a lot easier to talk about solving puzzles from a theoretical perspective than when you see them in politics or in society or in concrete actions. The world is much more messy, and I think literature is better at somehow conveying that sense of confusion and mess, but also then returning to the ideas and saying, well, how should we think of the human here, and what tensions are there, what moral decisions is this character making, and how are they responding. So for me, it's all about it's the same persons, it's the same ideas, the same kind of theories. But I'd say that in my literary writing, there is much more ambiguity, and they are more open also to the reader to draw their own conclusions. Whereas when I'm writing philosophy, there is a sense in which you're sort of trying to justify your theories. And so you start from a position of uncertainty and you explain to the public and they follow you, but it's also much more paternalistic because you're always the sort of academic or the philosopher that is explaining a certain way of seeing the world. With literature, it's almost the other way around. You have to start from concrete living beings and the circumstances, the messy circumstances of their lives. And if you were to try to write literature as you write philosophy, it would be terrible because it would be very dogmatic and you'd have these very abstract characters that are like masks of moral positions. And hopefully, you don't want that. You want a sense of exactly ambiguity. And I think literature is so interesting and productive because it also opens up to the reader and forces them to come into a journey and in many ways to continue the journey even after the author has done their work and given them the story continues to, they carry it and they think about it and they ask themselves questions about it. And so it's much more open, and I think literature is a much more democratic way of writing, and it's really democracy in action because it continues. It has this equality between the writer and the reader and continues. It's kind of ongoing deliberation.
And what's the best way to reach truth? Is it reading fiction or philosophy?
Well, I mean, I think I don't think there is a single path or a single way. I mean, for me, truth is not something that you start with. Truth is something that it's the end of the process. And I'm not really sure that we even know what is that truth, because it's a process of approximating something by learning from the failures of the past. So if there is any progress or if there is any way of thinking about truth, it has to come from learning from these mistakes and engaging with history in a way that shows us, where the path's not taken or where it went wrong or what people could have done differently if they had a different system and if they thought differently. So I think truth really is at the end rather than at the beginning, and how you get there varies, and both literature and philosophy and politics and history and anthropology and all the different fields of knowledge, each of them contributes something, but I don't think there's one discipline that is, where it is at.
Leah Ypi, your new book is called Indignity, a reimagined life, or a life reimagined. Yeah, a life reimagined. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Great. We'll have to do some